Thanks very much, Michael, and Alistair for organising it, and for the invitation and all of the different organisations funding it and so on. Very pleased to be invited. I'm approaching nationalism from two angles. 10 years ago I finished a Master's in Nationalism and Ethnic Conflict at Birkbeck in London, run by Eric Kaufman, a degree based on Anthony Smith's interpretation of nationalism studies. A couple of years later I went on to do a PhD exploring English identity and whiteness with supervisors who'd never read any of that nationalism stuff, who were far more interested in race and post-colonial and post-structuralist thinking. So I went off and did some of that sort of thing for a bit. I'm now returning to my previous haunts in nationalism studies, but in ways very much informed by the more recent training. And I'm drawing on both approaches to engage with influential recent work by quantitative political scientists exploring attitudes towards immigration and nationalist politics in contemporary Britain and England. And I'm referring to work by Robert Ford and Matthew Goodwin, Lauren McLaren, Will Jennings and others. The nationalism and race literatures don't really seem to be talking to each other very much. Many of those studying the politics of immigration don't really seem to have read either, for good reasons perhaps, as they're focusing on parliamentary politics in the state. What I would like to do with my current project and a book I'm writing about it what I'd like to do is bring these three areas into dialogue with one another and say something interesting about and to all of these people. What might happen, of course, is that it totally falls between the cracks and no one reads it at all, but we'll see, or I will. The research project through which I'm trying to achieve this took place during the 2015 general election. Seems an awful long time ago now, doesn't it? Where I undertook qualitative research with the aim of exploring contemporary relationships between politics and nationalism in England, in the context of a then meteorically rising UKIP. When I say I'm studying nationalist politics in England, many presume that I'm planning to infiltrate the English Defence League or something, but the definitions I'm using are more encompassing. So nationalism in what follows is, using good old Gellner, primarily a political principle which holds that the national and political units should be congruent, while Hobsbawm's addition to this that the political duty of nationals to the polity encompasses and represents the nation, overrides all other public obligations. And though fieldwork took place during a parliamentary election campaign, I'm referring to politics far more generally as that which is concerned with the construction and ideally the realisation of a sense of the collective good, and about choosing between competing interests and views, often demanding incompatible allocations of limited resources. The research site was Portsmouth, a city on the south coast of England, which in many ways I would argue offers a microcosm of English society and politics. The city is an island, struggling to find a role in the world following post-imperial decline. It even has its own north-south socio-economic divide. The more affluent south is populated by graduate students and an increasingly ethnically diverse population, many residents drawn there by the university for which I work. Council wards in the south are among the 20% least deprived in England, according to the 2015 indices of multiple deprivation. Just a few minutes walk northwards, parts of the appropriately named Charles Dickens ward fall into the most deprived 1%. Portsmouth's residents are 84% white British, 84% British born as well, very close to the overall national figures. And those situated in the more deprived central and northern areas are between 10 and 20% more likely to identify as English only as their nationality. In the EU referendum, while affluent St Jude and central South Sea wards voted 56 and 57% respectively for Remain, Baffin's, Charles Dickens and Paulsgrove wards voted 66, 67 and 70% respectively to leave. The constituency of Portsmouth South, where I undertook the fieldwork, had a Lib Dem MP when I started the research. It went Conservative in 2015 and earlier this year it elected a Labour MP. So overall I would argue that all English life can be found on this compact island city. During the general election, I conducted 40 in-depth qualitative interviews. So I undertook participant observation at numerous events in Portsmouth South, though I will only be discussing the interview data today, really. The aim of this approach was to enable a personal, in-place, embedded inquiry regarding politics and nationalism grounded in participants' qualitative narratives. Interviews started off with a discussion about participants' views regarding the local area before asking very general questions about the political issues important to them, what the survey analysts call front-of-mind concerns. A wait-and-listen approach was taken in relation to nationalist politics. If immigration was not raised by participants, I did so later in the interview, and specific questions were asked which aimed to tease out views regarding relationships between politics, nation and state. For example, by asking about the role of a government, who a government has responsibility for, who they represent, about issues involving the wider world, and so on. Interviews generally took place in participants' homes, and they ranged in length between 20 minutes and 3 hours, averaging at just over an hour. Sampling saw a good spread in terms of social backgrounds, though the sample was disproportionately affluent and situated on the liberal and left of politics, and also disproportionately white, actually. I'm writing a book about all this, which will be published by Routledge in a few months' time. Today I'm going to outline the two key political strata which emerged from the data analysis, which have similarities to findings from recent survey analysis, but also some crucial differences. So first I'll be looking at the explicit nationalism of the overlooked, and then the cosmopolitanism or nation scepticism of the more affluent. I'll be arguing that while nationalism remains central to imagining a polity in England, the conceptual and explanatory value of the nation or national identities with regard to contemporary English politics requires further investigation. I'll also be arguing that when it comes to really understanding what's going on politically south of the border, it is the economy stupid. So starting with the explicitly nationalist overlooked. Overlooked is essentially my rebranding of Ford and Goodwin's famous Left Behind, which I feel has some problematic connotations. The Left Behind are defined by Ford and Goodwin as older white people with relatively few educational qualifications. Central to their analysis of the Left Behind are who are far more likely than others to raise immigration as a key political issue facing the country. Central to the analysis is the premise that their national identities are being threatened by immigration or perceptions of immigration. Survey analysis finds apparent evidence again and again, in England and elsewhere, to suggest that a sense of cultural threat and a cultural backlash, with anti-immigration feeling at its core, far more than class, location or economic anxieties, are the key drivers for the recent upsurge in right-wing populist politics. I interviewed several people who could be categorised as left behind. They'd all lived all of their lives in Portsmouth, a city which they portrayed as having suffered severe decline. They all positioned themselves in relation to a sense of economic precariousness, and their core front-of-mind political concerns were all related in one way or another to material necessity. Many such participants positioned immigration as the key front-of-mind political issue and adopted distinctively nationalist interpretations of contemporary politics. One participant, Hillary, is the source of the term overlooked that I'm using. While railing against the unfairness of contemporary politics as she sees it, she stated that the government overlooks us. They overlook anyone like the unemployed, the disabled, the elderly. All those groups of people I think are treated really, really badly. They're just totally overlooked. And Hillary interprets her and her family's experiences of hardship in relation to immigration, though she routinely fails to draw any distinction between immigrants and ethnic minorities. A central part of her narrative, to which Hillary repeatedly returns, is an assault on her by an ethnic minority individual about 10 years ago, which left her disabled and unable to work. She blames immigrants and overcrowding for the inadequate social housing options available for her daughters, and describes the lift she uses to reach one daughter's home as stinking because of immigrants urinating in it. More generally, Hillary draws associations between immigrants, crime, and the threat of terrorism. And this kind of often racist and particularly Islamophobic stereotyping and myth was widespread among nationalist overlooked participants. Other examples of myth include rumours of halal sausages being forced on school children, Christmas being banned, England football shirts being banned from Portsmouth city centre. And they can be linked to survey evidence of an endemic exaggeration and misperception when it comes to the immigration debate. Immediately after recounting the anecdote about immigrants urinating in lifts, Hillary states that, that this is just wrong. This is England, let us be English. Hillary and other overlooked participants' solution to these issues is to end immigration and bring the state, society and the nation into a much closer relationship, and to prioritise the national group, which a lot of the time means the white English. But interestingly, when discussing other personal experiences with immigrants, somewhat removed from politicised interpretations and the national situation, the picture painted by overlooked participants is far, far more positive, a pattern again which is found in survey analysis. So when I asked Hillary whether she has had negative experiences with immigrants beyond the incident that left her disabled, she concedes that there has only been that particular one. Normally, I'd walk along the street and the little children say good morning or good afternoon, and I would say hello, and the adults are fine. Hillary's other key front-of-mind issue, alongside immigration, was very revealingly that of the increasing student population in her area. Like immigration, this was associated by her with a housing shortage, with antisocial behaviour, with a decline in the area's character and appearance. Other overlooked participants who positioned immigration front of mind discussed the need for the English to be prioritised politically in relation to social and economic concerns impacting on them personally, such as the imminent loss of a state-provided home, poor quality schooling for their children, and so on. These intimately felt experiences and attitudes are bound together by a general sense of injustice and disorientation relating to complex macro socio-economic shifts, which are then explained primarily in terms of values, culture and threat, and framed by nationalist, often racist, political prejudice and myth. Immigration is one symptom of this malaise, but it is the one that is foregrounded. And identifying as English in particular is important here, as it allows participants to claim a stake in politics and society. But I think that some survey analysts, by emphasising threatened identities, cultural threats, symbolic concerns, and often immigration itself, ahead of ideologically framed interpretations of politics and society, are putting the proverbial cart before the horse. They risk eliding how much nationalist ideology frames and provokes these threats in the first place, as well as how it frames their studies, ontology and research methodologies. Before I move on to discuss affluent cosmopolitanism, I'll add two important caveats regarding the overlooked. First, several overlooked participants were sympathetic towards immigration, or actively anti-nationalist in some cases. I just haven't got time to talk about them here. Second, several affluent participants also placed concerns about immigration as their key front-of-mind issue, but their views were less visceral, much calmer, as these brief examples illustrate. So Jeff, a businessman, says, "I am uncomfortable with uncontrolled immigration." Luke, a doctor, saying, the most middle-class English sentence in history. It doesn't sound such an awful thing to do, talking up immigration. Now, when it comes to voting or a survey scale measuring attitudes towards immigration, these views will be measured as similar to Hillary's, potentially. They could all easily be statistically lumped together and analysed as similarly threatened identities. But when you actually speak to these people, the tone is fundamentally different. Jeff's and Luke's anti-immigration attitudes are important to them, but nationalism is not drawn upon in relation to any kind of personal anxieties or trauma underlined by an economically precarious position. Though they are in some ways attitudinally as nationalist as Hillary, from a different perspective, nationalism does a lot less work for them personally and politically. And that's important if we're looking for a deeper understanding of political causation than attitudinal and voting patterns. Turning now to the second main category, two recent articles by Will Jennings and Jerry Stoker identify a cosmopolitan stratum of English society, global in outlook, pro-immigration, socially liberal, increasingly less likely to identify as national at all. And over in England, and over half of my sample might be considered to be cosmopolitan in these terms. These participants were relatively affluent, mostly graduates, professionals, public sector workers, technical workers and so on. Theirs is a far more optimistic portrayal of a city benefiting from economic regeneration, the growth of the university, increased ethnic diversity and so on. Most moved to the area and positioned their relationship with Portsmouth with regard to key events or life stages. Central to their perspective on place is the owned family home, which provides an apex for social, familial and employment networks extending beyond Portsmouth, around the country and internationally. And in contrast to overlooked participants who identified clearly with the city in which they had lived all of their lives, more affluent participants portrayed a privatised local existence which then enabled a mobile lifestyle with a far wider spatial reach. Among them, Portsmouth is portrayed in rather ambivalent terms as a means to an end, a temporary, contingent and instrumental location for their lives. I'm yet to read the book, but I suspect, based on reviews that I've read, that these are David Goodhart's anywheres, who he contrasts to the somewheres. Looks a bit like an open day slide, I think. Front of mind issues for these participants were never related to personal hardship and economic precariousness, not in the same way anyway. Explicitly nationalist concerns such as immigration weren't front of mind. When probed on immigration and related issues, most affluent cosmopolitans expressed clearly critical attitudes towards nationalist politics. A small number of participants, like Dunya, adopted an explicitly anti-nation state perspective. So Dunya, who has transnational family and social ties and identifies proudly and provocatively as an economic migrant, suggests that I think you can move and migrate anywhere, like birds migrating in the summer, as she herself feels able to do. From another angle, citing his personal experiences of working overseas, Richard states that people can move, will move, that's the way the world is evolving. Whether you like it or not, that's the way it is, that's the way it's going to be. Such pro-migration attitudes, valedictory of globalisation, were thus, in different ways, often directly associated with the kinds of mobility available to and lived by these participants. Several such participants positioned anti-immigration attitudes as inherently racist and dangerous, a betrayal of contemporary multi-ethnic Britain. The majority were more diffident and stridently anti-racist when discussing immigration. Colin doesn't worry about it, neither does Claire, doesn't bother Katie. Here we see immigration depoliticised, nationalist concerns strategically shut down as morally problematic. For all of these participants, the exclusionary nature of nationalism is empirically problematic, it doesn't reflect their own lives, and it's politically and morally problematic in relation to ideological frameworks influenced by liberalism and universalism. They seem to reject or query to some extent the nation as the natural political unit, if not as full-blown cosmopolitans, then at least as nation sceptics. However, though these participants were sceptical about the legitimacy of the nation as a political unit, the political issues they raised remained steadfastly parochial in character. Only one participant raised an unambiguously global issue as a front-of-mind concern, climate change. The refugee crisis went entirely undiscussed, despite the election campaign coinciding with its deadliest period. When international issues were discussed, this was generally in ways constrained by nation-state politics, so immigration was instrumentally positioned as good for Britain, good for us, likewise European integration. Even the most cosmopolitan-minded of participants routinely identified themselves with an us, a we, and so on, as Billy, Condor and others have identified and critiqued. Though I would suggest that among many of these participants, this pattern might be considered as indicative of banal statehood, so an habitual relationship with the state, far more than banal nationalism, due to the relative lack of an imagined national community. You know, the extent to which these more nation-sceptic participants were genuinely globally oriented and politically cosmopolitan was thus very limited. Their views did to some extent trouble the relationship between nation and state, but their locus of political concern remained thoroughly embedded within that nation-state. They were effectively nationalist, just without much or any sense of nationhood, which is the opposite of that which is desired by some cosmopolitan or universalist thinkers like Beck and Habermas, who wish to maintain the nation, the local ties and so on, but do away with nationalism. What comes to mind instead of political cosmopolitanism is Craig Calhoun's analysis of actually existing cosmopolitanism as the class consciousness of frequent travellers. A distance from economic and material necessity and the spatial networks and imaginaries of the mobile affluent contribute in key ways to the plausibility and legitimacy of ideological frameworks critical of the nation-state. So these views are no less related to economic inequalities and no less bound up in different ways with ideological myth than the explicit nationalism of the overlooked. So to conclude, I would argue that analysis of narrative qualitative accounts suggests that the key divisions in contemporary English politics are better explained by economic inequalities and ideological interpretations of these than by the notion of two camps situated either side of a cultural backlash. With the overlooked or left behind, much analysis does not sufficiently take into account the framing by nationalist ideology itself of participants' attitudes towards immigration or the methodologically nationalist framing of the analysis itself. While apparent cultural cleavages or symbolic concerns might very effectively predict political attitudes and voting patterns, these accounts are more limited if we're interested in a deeper political understanding of the present and the possible. Recent, more sophisticated survey analysis of class and place by Will Jennings, which doesn't rely on rather outdated measures of class or crude questions about economic anxieties, are also suggesting that underlying economic inequalities might, after all, explain contemporary political divides in England. And while identifications as English, British, as a migrant or as nothing are important to people I spoke to, I think that to start in our analysis with identities rather than the ideological frameworks through which they are constructed is problematic. And I think there is actually more scope for individual agency and for political change if we foreground the ongoing process of reproducing and disrupting ideologies, and it's important for analysts to do so, particularly when ideas about identity are perhaps feeding directly into party and government policies. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Thanks to all the speakers. We're inevitably running a little bit late, but thanks to the speakers for more or less staying on time. I believe that my handsome assistant at the back has a microphone. Yep. Let's take 2 or 3 questions and start the conversation going. So stick your hand up so that Alistair can see you. If you don't stick your hand up, I'll ask questions, inane, boring questions for the rest of the afternoon. So save yourselves from me. Okay, I warned you. Whilst you're thinking of that, Nasser, I noticed a comment, a kind of aside you made right at the start, using the term New Scots. And it might be interesting to sort of think about the sort of prehistory of that. And that term's about 25 years old now. Comes out of the SNP's attempts to construct a civil nationalism. And it strikes me, at what point do the New Scots become Scots? Might be something worth asking. I think the lady's got a question at the back. Can you tell us who you are, first of all?
Yes,
thank you.
I'm Kate Butler from Neighbouring University. Thank you very much to all the speakers. It was a really interesting combination of talks. I just wanted to ask a question, maybe to the whole panel, about the comparative approach, because often there's, I think with the first talks, there was this idea of we often look at Scotland as opposed to England, and actually that's quite problematic in terms of, maybe that's not problematic in and of itself, but I suppose could you speak to some of the limitations of that approach and how that maybe shapes public or policy perceptions about the differences as well? Does that make sense? And then I had another question for the last speaker about whether austerity came out in terms of a front of mind issue and how that was maybe narrated in relation to immigration.
Thank you. Good questions. Anyone else got a pressing question? We'll go with those then. Charlie, do you want to take that first since you?
Yeah. Well, with the first question about limitations, yeah, definitely. I've got a proper answer to that and then a facetious answer. And I'll start with the facetious answer. I was interviewed for a job at Edinburgh Napier 5 years ago, and I would totally have done a comparative study between England and Scotland. That was in my interview, but I didn't get the job. So that's why there isn't a... But the sensible answer is, yeah, it's a major problem, and that people are, even people who are really critical of nationalism and methodological nationalism and so on, and then doing single nation-based studies. I mean, the McCrohan and Beckhofer book that was cited is an example of where that has been. Although even in that book, I think it's studies that were done by different people in different nations by and large. But I think a far more cross-national set of studies would be definitely very helpful there. In terms of austerity, yeah, definitely. Again, I mean, Hillary, who I quoted up there a couple of times, she talked about her disability benefits being cut. That was one of the things that she railed against in terms of unfairness. But the front of mind issues that she kept returning to were immigration, particularly the immigrant who had disabled her, and I didn't talk about it there, but the police, because the police had failed to protect her from this immigrant. And she said that we don't have a police force anymore, referring to the white English. So her way of talking about austerity in terms of cuts to disability benefits was through immigration and through law and order. And others talked about couple of guys I spoke to in a pub, had an interview with them. They talked about the bedroom tax, and they didn't talk. They said that new laws, the new policies in terms of social housing meant that they were going to be kicked out of their houses. But they said, what else can it be but immigration? The numbers of immigrants coming over, and I wanted to say, well, it's the bedroom tax, isn't it? That the coalition government has brought in. So yeah, austerity was there, but it was very, very much interpreted through nationalist and to some extent authoritarian lenses.
The importance of the problems of comparison, I guess, Hannah, here it's slightly different because your role in the Cabinet Office is really about comparison. I'm not going to ask you to kick off, but it might be interesting for you to look at the sort of policy angle in that. But who wants to take that one?
I just wanted to mention in terms of the comparison of the data, one of the things we found during the project and during the development of the website is that each government department captured ethnicity data in different ways. So it wasn't possible to compare the education data to the employment data because the groups just didn't cut across, or the survey size didn't cut across. So one of the things we are looking at is driving consistency in data capturing and data presentation, in particular on ethnicity data. I
mean, there's a very specific answer to your question that actually even within central government departments, different things have been counting. Dare I say, joined up thinking?
You can whisper it.
While ago, so some real challenges there. What about the more academic?
Well, I mean, the question I have with comparison is why? Why compare? And the typical response one gets is that, well, we don't know what will happen in the future, but we know what will happen elsewhere. And maybe we can learn something about ourselves by looking at how different social relations or different societies behave. And I think there's something in that, but I also think that the comparison should also be where we are now from where we have come. And I'm struck by the way in which, when we think about the changing nature of Britishness, whatever its current status and whatever its current configuration, it has changed profoundly in my adult lifetime. And in my adult lifetime, in my lifetime, when I was growing up, Britishness was something that the NF used to talk about. You know, they'd have Union Jacks and racist dogs. Whereas there's certainly been some kind of a reclaiming of it. And when people like Diane Abbott and Bernie Grant, I suppose, kind of held up, and writers, people like Salman Rushdie and Hanif Qureshi, they kind of held a mirror up to British society and said, who do you think you are? Not who do you think we are? We think we call ourselves British. You don't say we're British. Okay, we need to have a conversation about this. In a way in which I don't see that with Scottishness at the moment. What I see with Scottishness is some kind of relatively benevolent paternal inclusion. I mean, we've talked a little bit about the way in which the symbolism of what Scotland is still remains partly hierarchical, and your point as ever is on the money. I don't know where your money is, but your point as ever is on the money insofar as when do the new Scots become Scots? Because the new Scots implies an old Scots. Are we now going to be using the characterisation of the French? Francois de Souche, the old stock. Will my daughter be a new Scot, or will she be a Scot? I think these are difficult conversations for societies to have in terms of what their national identities are meant to say about what the society is. And I suppose it's one way in which we might distinguish the identity of a nation from people's national identities. People's national identities, I think, actually are much more dynamic than the identity of nations, and often are ahead of the identity of nations. And we can take the French example as being one case. Actually, in attitude surveys, when people self-define as French, they're relatively hybrid and plural. But the identity of the French nation is still fixed in something in 1958, it feels like. So why compare? Do comparative, but you also need to tell a story about where you've come from, is one response to that. I don't know if that's getting at the kind of question you were asking.
Yes, yeah, I was sort of thinking about Ross's talk as well, about the Scottishness versus, what do you identify? And you said that lots of people identified as Scottish and something else, definitely more Scottish than English. And I've done some research about whether people of different ethnic and religious minority, young people living in Scotland, identify as Scottish. And often it's, definitely more than English or British. And so it's always this, that people take on this kind of comparison to one other. And I find it interesting, this Scotland-England comparison, rather than what about Scotland and Wales, or Scotland and Northern Ireland, or Scotland and somewhere else. That was kind of what I was getting at.
Well, I could probably speak for quite a long time about this actually, and I think it's don't worry, I think it's a great and interesting question, this issue of comparison with regard to Scotland. One, because often we kind of come out with these statements, is Scotland different, and we don't even bother to explicitly say what we're comparing it with. It's often just this implicit thing, and it usually is implicitly England. So I think even doing that more explicitly and then also recognising the limitations of that is important. One limitation being that a lot of people do argue to say, well, it's not a problem that people in minority ethnic groups in England don't identify as English. That's not an issue. They identify as British, and Englishness is just an ethnic, category amongst many others. And I can accept that up to a point, but I don't entirely buy it. But then I think we need to go beyond, and we need to compare not just with places like Wales and Northern Ireland, but also with, I know that Eve Hepburn, and sometimes in cahoots with Michael, has done some writing about comparing Scotland to Quebec and Catalonia and places like that, and thinking about what some people have called cultural barriers to inclusion, so linguistic barriers and things like that. So we need to do that, but also recognise the limitations of comparison, that we're not always comparing like with like, it's a complex business, and do the important historical comparison, because I suspect a lot of what's going on here is that, and the reason that we don't talk about new Brits amongst minority ethnic groups in England, is we kind of have got over that threshold. We have kind of got past that point where they're new. They're no longer new. They, Britishness becomes something that is as shaped by these groups as shaping them. And so maybe we will get to that place in Scotland. But as a final point, I think the whole New Scots thing is very complicated as well. It's been used in a lot of different ways by a lot of different constituencies. And my earliest awareness of it was in fact used by people who were mainly from England, who supported the SNP or supported independence, and they called themselves New Scots, and it then got attached to people who come here as students and who, the Scottish political classes wanted to stay, and then also to people in minority ethnic groups. But
and now to refugee incorporation.
Exactly. So when does new not become new? And I suspect that some of what you see going on amongst groups like Scottish Pakistanis, Scottish Sikhs, the reasons why you often get, to some degree at least, stronger identification as Scottish amongst these groups is because they're the more established kind of minority groups in Scotland, and so this uniting of, well, I'm Sikh but I'm Scottish as well, just becomes more natural, and hopefully in time that'll become the case for the majority perspective as well.
No, I absolutely agree that being established, and actually critical mass is important too to this dynamic. But one other point that comes to mind whilst you were speaking about we got over New Brits, we never had it, is actually the relationship that then has to Englishness. I mean, I don't think Englishness is solely premised upon white people distancing themselves from a Britishness that they think is compromised, but it partly is. It's a feature of it. And Charles, I'd be interested to hear kind of your take on that, given that you're kind of researching Englishness in this context of an anti-immigrant and anti-ethnic diversity landscape, partly at least.
Yeah, well, that's certainly true. The pattern that you just described, and Jeff, who was one of the affluent explicit nationalists who I mentioned earlier, he partly defined his Englishness in relation against Scottishness as well. There's a bit of that, bit of sort of resentment about
what the Scots get,
about money and all the money that comes up here and all that sort of thing, and then being a bit uppity, wanting independence. Well, sod off then, and that sort of thing. But yeah, so but then you've also got, I met you at the conference a few months ago where Tariq Madood was saying we won the battle with Britishness, we being ethnic minority residents, we can do it with Englishness as well, and there's a substantial number of ethnic minority individuals in England who are, Sundar Katwala's campaigning for it as well, who are trying to re-signify and reinvent Englishness, and there is movement. I think even since 2011, since the census, there's evidence that more and more people who didn't identify as English are identifying more confidently as English. Now, whether that's taken a hit since last year and the increase in English nationalism, confidently voiced anti-immigration, English nationalism, so on. I don't know, but
yeah. Thank you.
We'll watch this space. I think we have another question at the. Could you let us know who you are?
My name is Paulina Czewoda. I'm a researcher from the University of Glasgow. I work on migration. And I wanted to ask a maybe slightly provocative question, but I was wondering, why is this national identity so important? Why are we focusing on it so much? Because I'm a qualitative researcher, and from my point of view of a person who's working on migration, I would ask my participants not about their national identity. I'd ask about feelings of belonging, about relationships with other people, feeling part of the community, feeling accepted, or their feelings of well-being, rather than focusing on what is your national identity. Do you feel British enough? Because for me, it looks like maybe it's more important from the point of view of the British statehood or from the host community, rather than these people who come to build their lives in the UK. So I wanted to ask you, why do you read so much into this national identity? Why is it so important?
Okay, over to you. Ross, you may speak for no more than 2 minutes on this one.
Yeah, well, maybe that's in a sort of perhaps rather clumsy way. I suppose that was what I was trying to do at the very beginning, is to say that we shouldn't fall into that trap of thinking that this is all important. But I also think it's difficult to separate these things out entirely. So the things that you're saying are important, and things like identities. It used to be like, I'm old enough to remember pre-devolution in Scotland, and people used to cite endless surveys saying, oh look, when you ask people in Scotland about devolution, it's only 10th on their list. You know, it's way below education and health and all these other things. Well, of course it was, but that didn't mean to say it was insignificant, because people saw these things as bound up together. They saw that, they argued that, well, if we had greater autonomy, then we'd be able to address these other areas like education and health in different ways. So I guess one argument would be, well, we could say a similar thing here, that identity and the way that people identify and the way that others allow them to identify, either explicitly or implicitly, is bound up with other things related to social justice and social inclusion and things like that. So especially, I think, for people in minority groups who are born, brought up in Scotland, speak with a Scottish accent, if with all that someone's still sort of saying to you, you're not really one of us, you can't be one of us even though you want to be, to me that is problematic. You know, in a sense, that is fundamentally problematic and could be related to other dimensions of social justice, etc. But having said that, you know, I'm totally with your point. I think we definitely don't want to fall into the trap of just saying, well, this is all important and this kind of governs everything, and we should really, you know, look at this rather than all the other things that we mentioned.
Charlie, you mentioned on a slide the sort of approach that you took, the sort of John Fox and Cynthia Miller-Idris. Do you want to kind of expand on?
Yeah. Well, I mean, with my PhD, I asked people, do you feel English? What does Englishness mean to you? And so on. And I think there's lots of interesting findings in that. However, I don't ask those questions anymore. I didn't ask those questions at all in this research. I have taken on the Brubaker and before him Bourdieu and subsequently John Fox and colleagues' work on everyday nationhood, which Michael was just referring to. And that's particularly seeing, you know, if the nation is brought up, if so, when, how, for what purposes and so on, rather than going along and looking for the nation and then finding it and interpreting it in particular ways. I think an approach that is based on not assuming its salience and its resonance evenly at different points, even at moments when you would expect it to be salient and resonant, such as discussions of immigration or even a political rally or at a July the 4th picnic or a Bastille Day fireworks show, whatever it might be. You know, we need to, are people actually thinking about the nation and identifying with the nation at those points? And if they are, what does it mean? If they're not, how are they identifying? I think these are the questions that nationalism studies needs to look into. I think that's the direction we should go down. But it's very, very difficult to do that with quantitative analysis. And it's very, very, very difficult to do with qualitative analysis. But even really, really difficult with surveys and so on. But I think that's got to be the future, because we still know very, very little about these identities to a significant extent, and when they are important. and that's particularly important if fewer people are identifying with the nation, then rather than going as some people do, oh, that means people aren't going to pay taxes and pay for welfare state and so on because they don't identify with the nation anymore. Well, we don't know that for sure. We don't know that cosmopolitan identifications don't necessarily marry up with associative obligations, the sort of things the liberal nationalists talk about. But I'm going off on one there.
Okay, I think we've got another question. Do we? Alistair's there?
That's right, yeah.
Okay, one more question. There'll be an opportunity after the next session if anyone's got burning questions.
Michael, can I just push back on that question as well, if there's a moment, if I may? Just very briefly, which is, I mean, I'd kind of put the question back to you to some extent, which is to ask, well, is it not also an issue of generation insofar as first generations are much less, not necessarily interested, but confident to make the claims on nationhood? Insofar, whereas the evidence tells us the second generation, the third generations are and expect to be part of whatever fabric of the national story that's kind of constructed. And, you know, in that respect, national identity becomes all manner of indirect and direct indicators of whether or not you're included. So it doesn't surprise me that first generations, in the way in which you've talked about, do not indicate it as being a priority for them. I mean, that's always been the case, you know, from the classic migration literature and the myth of return and all that stuff. But it's always there, the story of the nation, in terms of whether or not we truly are accepted. And it comes up eventually.
Lady at the back, tell us who you are.
Hi, my name's Eve. I'm a PhD student at the University of Aberdeen. I just had a quick question for Charlie about, you didn't really mention it at all, but kind of where people were picking up on these ideas of kind of these nationalist sentiments. Did people talk to you at all, for example, about the media, about conversations with neighbours or friends or family? Or I know you fed in some personal experiences that people had had, but I just wondered if you had kind of a bit more to say really about where you perceive these kind of ideas and nationalist sentiments to be developing from.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, Nigel Farage was mentioned a few times, quite a lot. What he said on telly the other day, you know, the way that he was sticking up for them, as perceived. Other than that, no, I mean, I didn't actually ask them. I don't know how they would have answered the question, really, where are you getting these ideas from? I know that's not what you're suggesting. You should have asked them. You know, I mean, a lot of it, it's difficult to tell, you know, it's difficult to tell where people, you know, get the ideas about Christmas being banned, about, you know, England football shirts being banned from Portsmouth city centre and that sort of thing. Yes, I don't know where that sort of thing comes from. You know, and I could just speculate really as to where they might come from, but there's not much point doing that. You know, down the pub, on the internet, amongst friends and family and so on. But then, as I say, you know, when I asked, you know, it's absolutely classic sort of thing that you get when talking to people who are hostile towards immigration. You know, when I said, but in your everyday life, you know, how do you get on with people who you meet at work and so on? And it was oh, so and so's all right. You know, it's the other ones who are problematic. So I think it's the general sort of political mobilisation around nationalism mixed up with. I mean, one or two of them did mention the Daily Mail and papers they'd read and so on. It's the general sort of nationalist atmosphere and ether, I think, with all these myths rebounding around and a legitimate feeling that they are legitimate. You know, even though there's an awareness that they're problematic and that there are issues with them. And you know, the guy who said the thing about England football shirts, I said, well, has anyone actually told you that you can't wear an England football shirt? And he said, no, but I've heard it happens. You know, and these people will also say, oh, I know the Daily Mail speaks a load of rubbish, but then they'll quote it. So yeah, it's a tricky one. I
mean, I think there's a really interesting issue there about circulating ideas, and certainly in a undergraduate class I did that NASA taught on, I put Muslim and Islam into newspaper headlines in the LexisNexis, which you may have access to over the last. And there were things about, you know, something to do with Christmas is banned, and then the codicil was always in case it offends Muslims. That's maybe something we haven't talked about, is the kind of sliding between sort of immigration and race and actually a very powerful discourse that's going on around you know, Islamophobia. Can we have a sort of first, sorry, we're going to have to, can we have a one-sentence response to kind of the events here before we move to coffee? Otherwise we'll run out, but you can be first for the questions after.
I think this is an unfolding story, and I don't think we've precisely got the right handle on the proper relationship between the nation, between race and ethnicity and migration in Scotland yet. And in that respect, it's an exciting area to work on, but also a challenging one.
I think in terms of the opportunity that the website's giving us, we're the first ever country to do this, and I think it's given us a really big opportunity in terms of transparency and accountability for having a fairer future for everyone.
Desperate thing there's on to say. I suppose I'll contradict what I just said, and I'm going to go slightly and say that yes, there are sort of communities in inverted commas that are very well established in Scotland, but in a sense we're still quite new to this diversity business, if you like, and that is the data that NASA alluded to at the very beginning is showing that diversity is increasing, not exactly exponentially, but very rapidly and very quickly. So from that perspective, yeah, it's an exciting time to be looking at these issues in Scotland, because it's something that we're going to have to deal with increasingly.
Charlie, the view from Portsmouth?
View from Portsmouth is, yeah, just echo that really, what Ross was saying. I think that, you know, how quickly things are changing in terms of that diversity, in terms of, you know, the general political atmosphere, and, you know, God only knows what's going to happen over the next couple of years. You know, I think it's a really fascinating and important time to be studying this area, and yeah.
NASA eloquently talked about why compare. I'm just going to urge you, if you're an academic or a scholar or a student, to go compare. And on that very poor dad joke, let's have 10 minutes to have some. I believe there's coffee here. So let's thank our speakers and reassemble in 10 minutes.
Thank you.